clashes between rival groups of fans in 2012. BBC News.
You're listening to NewsHour. When Islamic State took Mosul last year, the world was shocked. A new movement from nowhere controlled a major city. How did that happen? How could that happen? The caliphate is so closed, so impenetrable, it's difficult to be sure what it even consists of, never mind how it got there. But inevitably, information seeps out, and the German magazine Der Spiegel has got access to a remarkable set of documents that show some of the planning that went into Islamic State. Christoph Reuter has seen the documents. In fact, to do so, he went to the Syrian town of Tal Rifat, north of Aleppo, which is now in rebel hands, but which used to be the home to a former Iraqi intelligence officer who went under the nom de guerre Haji Bakr.
The interesting thing when we worked about him was that in 2003, or before the fall of the regime, he was absolutely not religious. He was a hardcore Ba'athi, a career officer, a brilliant planner, very firm, but not an Islamist. He rose through the ranks of the Islamic State simply to use Islam, to use jihad, to use the fanatism as a new ideology in which name you can demand that people obey to your orders. But the core of the structure of the Islamic State, which is reflected in his papers, is anything but religious.
This is very interesting. So you've got a man here who was a colonel under Saddam Hussein in intelligence, and he saw the possibility of using an Islamist movement to basically fight the government in Baghdad, but starting in Syria.
Yeah, absolutely. It was him and 4 or 5 other officers. They had to choose this kind of detour because confronting the government in Baghdad, they had tried again and again and again, and they had failed. They were too weak to openly fight Baghdad. So when the order in Syria basically melted in the process of the revolution, he designed a specific part of how secretly infiltrate villages, towns, under the pretext of starting dawah offices for Islamic missionary offices, how to hire spies, how to start sleeping cells.
Okay, we'll get onto the tactics more in a moment, but just to understand this man and where he was coming from. So would you say he was basically one of those Saddam Hussein people in the security service who was upset with the American invasion, had nothing to do when the army was disbanded, and then started opposing the Shia governments? Would that be it?
Yes, exactly. This is how it started. He went underground in 2003, absolutely embarrassed and jobless after the decree of Paul Bremer to dismiss the whole Iraqi army, including him and 1,000 others of highly educated officers. So he went underground first and got in touch with Abu Musab Zarqawi, the head of by then Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2004-05, and slowly he would grow in the ranks of the Islamic State. First, the real jihadis, or people who believed, they distrusted the officers because they saw them as former enemies, clean-shaven, not religious. But in 2010, when like 80-90% of the leadership got killed, including the predecessor of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, this was the moment when a small cell of former Ba'athi intelligence officers, led by Haji Bakr, basically took over from inside and made Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi the emir, because he was the only one with religious credentials. But from then on, the inner circle of leadership is a group of former intelligence officers, and Haji Bakr was the most brilliant planner.
Right, and you take that from the document. So let's talk a bit about that specifically then. You've seen basically his plans, and he was trying to organise how IS could take over villages. So just talk us through what he wrote as a method of getting a village or a small town.
Well, step one would be with the small group they had come to Syria in 2012, hire former spies from the regime or hire people who are disgruntled with rebels and train people from villages in small missionary offices, in small dawah offices they opened all over northern Syria in early 2013. And Haji Bakr was writing a long list of what these people then had to spy about, like the power structure of the village, which family is rich, what are the relations between the families, who of the prominent leaders in this town is criminal, is gay, has a secret affair, so we can blackmail him. Who will oppose us for sure, so we have made to make him disappear sooner or later. Who is the imam? Who's paying the imam? Etc., etc. They wanted to know everything about each and every village, town, etc. And then slowly they would start, for example, try to marry their members into influential families without these families knowing that the guy who has married into them is one of Daesh's people.
Is one of the Islamic State people, yes, I see. And so they get right into the knowledge of what's going on in the village, who's who, and then how do they use that information?
The next step was either to get people on their side with pressure, with blackmailing, or with money sometimes, or those people whom they thought they will resist their takeover, they were simply abducted and disappeared and later killed, and the Islamic State would deny to have any knowledge of this. And in this anarchic situation of northern Syria, where there was no clear, coherent state order anymore, these people had been extremely important. If you take out the leading figure of a local council or of a rebel brigade, people become paralyzed, clueless. And then in the next step, they would attack certain single rebel brigades while they had secret contracts, deals with all the others, kind of agreement not to attack each other. So all the other groups thought, okay, we will be spared. It's just a little conflict the Islamic State has with Brigade A. So they would take them out one by one by one until they were the strongest force and could impose their order on a town.
I mean, what you've just described is absolutely amazing, because basically these people, with good preparation, could kidnap a handful of key individuals, do a few deals, but all without much force, they could end up terrifying everyone and in charge.
Yeah, and this is also described in the plans how first, in the first phase, they try to be camouflaged, they try to tarnish their identity, while in the later phase, they display this utter brutality, because once they are openly in charge, they want to make clear to each and everybody that they are ultimately brutal.
And this Haji Bakr, whose documents you saw, what happened to him?
He kind of outsmarted himself, which was unexpected to the Islamic State. Finally, all the Syrian rebels got united in early 2014 and decided it's either us or the Islamic State. They had found out about who killed people. They had seen this step by step creeping power game of the Islamic State. So they got united and fought the Islamic State simultaneously. And Haji Bakr had stayed in the northern Syrian town of Tal Rifat in a very modest house, not in the IS headquarters. Nobody knew he was living there. And when the battle started, IS could hold half of the town, and the rebels, the Syrian rebels, took over the other half, but his house was in the other half. So he was in rebel-held area. And then one of the neighbors told the rebels, there is a strange Daeshi sheikh living as my neighbor in this house. So they came and wanted to arrest him. He started shooting, and then accidentally, basically, the rebels shot him without even knowing at that moment that this was Haji Bakr. This was the architect of the Islamic State. They had no clue. It took them one day to find out and to come back and collect the computers and the papers.
Right, because you're saying basically this bloke, it's an amazing story you've got, that this man living in an obscure, really pretty obscure town north of Aleppo in an inconspicuous house, just alone with his wife, but from the papers and the documents and what you've been able to find out with corroborating interviews, you think he was a key figure?
Yeah, because we interviewed the former bodyguard of the envoy of Al-Qaeda, of Zawahiri, who had met Haji Bakr, but never Baghdadi, because the real deals were made with Haji Bakr and with two other Baas officers. We found what is mentioned in the papers corroborated through research and interviews, and also through a second trove of files we got from the Islamic State headquarters in Aleppo later, where all the steps Haji Bakr described, this was confirmed because there were the protocols of how they had achieved this. So we have several layers of basically the same story.
You have this insight now into how Islamic State operates, and you've seen it more close up than certainly most reporters, most journalists. What is your assessment of where the organization is headed now?
This depends on how many leading figures from the old Saddam era will remain and survive in the core leadership. What we see today is a fascinating merger of fanatics, jihadis on the one side, and cold-blooded strategists on the other side. As long as this joint venture is functioning, and we have seen this as the main reason for the enormous expansion and victories of the last year, as long as this joint venture functions, they will remain extremely resilient against foreign pressure, against the bombing, against internal pressure as well. Their biggest enemy is when they would start to believe their own propaganda and when the jihadis would take over and lose the element of strategic planning, because then they would do mistakes and basically become a victim of their own fanatism, and people would go in rebellion against them, or they would do military mistakes. Like for now, they are leaving provinces, pulling out of provinces, displaying very strategic military planning, other than jihadis before. So as long as this joint venture continues, they will be more resilient than many people think about them. But once they start, or they would fall back into a classical jihadi movement, they would lose.
And that was Christoph Reuter. For years, a small community in Rio has been fighting